Our next fellow-elect, a colleague of Bruce's, is Professor Alistair Thomson, Head of the School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies at Monash. Alistair.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the honour of election to the Academy. I've spent most of my working life working as an oral historian, enjoying the tremendous pleasure of asking people simply to tell me your story and then using those stories to illuminate a whole range of different historical topics. Particularly the stories of groups of people or of aspects of historical experience or subjectivity that are less likely to be found easily in the archives. And I've done this work in Britain, where I was for 20 odd years at the University of Sussex, and then back in Australia for the last 7 years at Monash. And I've done it in both academic and community contexts, and the oral history movement is a movement that combines academic and community-based researchers. And over the years I've used oral history in the 1980s to record First World War veterans and try to understand especially their experience of coming back to Australia and the challenges of living their post-war lives and living with the legend of their lives. Or after that I've studied post-war British migrants, particularly because I was living in Britain, the return migrants whose stories are very easily forgotten in the national celebration of migration history. And from there I've moved on to exploring through oral history the experiences of families and parenthood, of motherhood and fatherhood in the 50s and 60s in Australia. Like most oral historians, we've often been on the defensive because our sources have often been criticised by particular types of social scientists, and we've become very careful, probably more careful than most historians, to think hard about the sources we use and to think about how memory works and how we might use it best as historians. But one of the things that we've done over the years is to turn the so-called problem of memory as a historical source into a resource as well as a problem, to think that the stories that we're collecting, because there's always a relationship between the time of the event, the 1950s, and the time of the telling in the 2010s, the stories that we're collecting as oral historians don't only allow us to illuminate aspects of historical experience in the past, but also enable us to explore the meaning of those experiences in people's present lives, whether it's veterans in the 1980s as old men trying to understand this story that's transformed around them and which they've struggled to live with throughout their lives, or whether it's women, elderly women, just in recent years, looking back to their time as young mothers in the 1950s and 60s, but through the prism of a feminism which they may or may not share, but which casts dramatically different light on their experiences as young parents. We've also, because the stories that we tell are always shaped by the languages and meanings available in our culture, and as those languages and meanings change across time, the stories we collect as oral historians they're both personal stories, but they're also social and cultural stories. And so as oral historians, we're also interested in the relationship between individual storytelling, how we make sense of our own lives, and the public narratives around us. So my first book, Anzac Memories, was about these old men through their lives as soldiers and veterans and old diggers, but it was also about living with the legend of their lives and the ways in which the Anzac legend both included and excluded aspects of their experience, both affirmed and silenced these men. The project I've been most involved in over the last few years is the Australian Generations Oral History Project, which is a collaboration between historians and sociologists at Monash and La Trobe and the National Library here in Canberra and ABC Radio National. And we've collected 300 long life story interviews with 50 Australians born in each decade from the 1920s to the 1980s. Quite unusual for oral historians to record younger people. And we've been doing a number of things with this project, which is just coming to conclusion. One of the things we've been trying to do is to experiment with new digital technologies for both recording and preserving and disseminating digital oral history. And so pretty much within the next 6 months, about 800 hours of life story interviews will be available with linked time summaries for you, but also for researchers anywhere, forever to use. And then when the remainder come online, when various consent conditions open up, then there'll be about 1,200 hours of life story interviews. And the interviews, we had our closing conference and workshop last week where we presented back to our interviewers and our interviewees and others some of the first fruits of this project. And just to give you two examples, one of the things we've been looking at is the nature of generation. And what's really clear from these interviews is that the generational cliches that are spouted by media pundits and pop sociologists really don't make a lot of sense, that most Gen Y and Gen X don't think of themselves particularly as a generation, and that the so-called baby boomers are really split between two very different groups. Only one of whom really think of themselves as a generation, and it's not because of the time of their birth in the 40s or 50s or very early 60s, but it's the time of their coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s. And if we had $1 for every interviewee who said that Gough Whitlam changed my life because they were born in the early 1940s, the mid 1940s or the 50s, that's a group that really sees themselves as a generation. The other topic that we really, probably the most striking material that's come out of these interviews, and we didn't expect it, and we should have expected it, because mental health is so much easier to talk about now than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. These interviews are full of mental ill health, of grandparents, of uncles and aunts, of siblings, of children, and of the interviewees themselves. And their stories of mental health under the period of institutionalisation and of mental ill health under the so-called era of community care. And it's an extraordinary resource because it wasn't created to ask people about mental ill health. We asked people to tell me your life story and asked them to talk for maybe 4 or 5 hours in 2 sessions, but mental ill health comes through strong and clear and in extraordinary detail. The last thing I want to say is that for me, being a researcher has always been very closely tied with my experience as a teacher. I'm pretty sure that my greatest impact as a researcher hasn't been through the things that I've written, but it's through the students that I've taught, and particularly the students that I hope I've taught to be passionate about their own research at undergraduate and postgraduate level, and to be historians, not just to read other historians, but to be historians. And just to give you one closing example, this last week with colleagues I've been marking 50 video histories produced by second-year Monash history students. And these students 12 weeks ago had probably never done a history research project, and we said, here are 2 sets of source material. There's some material in the Museum Victoria that we'd like you to think about using, or you can use sources from your own family or local history. So they did that. They found photographs and they conducted oral history interviews, and they found letters and diaries and objects in the museum. And they then did secondary research on the topic, whether it was the First World War or post-war migration or the Depression of the 1930s or institutionalisation and mental ill health or Indigenous experience in interwar Melbourne and so on. They did secondary research, and then what they did was that they scripted a 3-minute video history. They tried to crystallise the research down to 3 minutes, and then they learnt the skills of making a film. And they all made a film which is now available on the Museum Victoria website, which we're going to showcase at an event at the museum next week. And several of the best films are going to be linked to the Museum Victoria collection so that other researchers will be able to benefit from what these level 2 history students have done. And for me, that's the most gratifying research experience that I've had in recent years. Thank you.